Welcome back. The New South Institute now making some suggestions that could really change the way government works and improve the services that you receive. It's suggesting that a section of the Public Service Act should be changed. It also wants government to adopt a reform proposed in what's called the Public Administration Management Bill. Let's try and put that into English, shall we? Dr. Ivor Chipkin is the author of a new policy brief from the New South Institute. Dr. Chipkin, good afternoon, and thanks for coming through this afternoon. Some of this can be quite technical. It's important to get the technicalities right. Are we talking about cadre deployment? Are we talking about how people are appointed into the public service?
So, hi, Stephen. It's lovely to be here. So cadre deployment is really, it just takes advantage of a situation that exists through our legislation. So the problem is not cadre deployment, it's the broader environment which it happens. Cadre deployment, for example, could not be as detrimental as it is if ministers and the president did not have the discretion in the space of recruitment. They couldn't, if an ANC committee recommended to a minister to appoint someone, if the minister actually didn't have that legislative power. The problem lies earlier in the transition with the Public Service Act of 1994. And remarkably, for those of you who are, I won't get into the technical details, but from a public administration perspective, the 1994 Public Service Act is remarkable for two things. It gives politicians, the president and the relevant minister, discretion over recruitment. Incredible. Most places in the world, the appointment of public services goes through quite a rigorous, autonomous process from the political process. The second thing which it does, which is quite remarkable, is it gives politicians discretion over operational matters in departments, which is why there's often tension between the politicians and the Director General, for example, or senior officials, because they want that kind of administrative power to make decisions in the departments, and yet that control lies with the minister. So unless the minister delegates that authority to the officials' hands are tied, and it creates what the National Development Plan called euphemistically tensions in the political administrative interface. So that's the origin. So cadre deployment really operates within that broader space. We can understand where that comes from, the want to politicize the public service in the way in which the ANC did after 1994. They inherited this apartheid era bureaucracy. Many of those positions have been continued through the sunset clause in the transition. But nonetheless, they have been devastating for institution building in the post-apartheid period. We are recommending in the current period that the Public Service Act is either scrapped in its entirety or that it's radically reformed. And in particular, we're recommending those clauses which give politicians discretion over recruitment and over operations. Those clauses in particular either get amended or scrapped altogether.
Okay, so if the ministers and the president don't make the appointments of who runs government departments, don't make the appointments of these officials, who does?
So one of the great innovations over the last 100 years has been a growing separation, autonomy of the administrative sphere of government, the people that decide on how policy is implemented, and the political sphere, which are the people that determine what is the policy. And in a sense that these two spheres are actually autonomous. The how of how government works as opposed to the what of government, these need to be separated.
So that would be, for example, the Minister of Social Development would say, we are going to give people social grants, and we're going to give people social grants of, for argument's sake, 350 Rand. An official, probably an accountant, is going to work out how we do that, whether we do it through the post office or whatever it is. But I'm giving the official the instruction, pay people a social grant of 350 Rand, and that's where their power stops.
So this is the idea of the separation between the political and the administrative. It's exactly right. So the politicians, and especially in a democracy, we elect those politicians precisely to come up with policy and determine the political direction of the country. No matter how radical or conservative that policy might be, that is the discretion of politicians. What the great reforms of the late 19th century and 20th centuries have said is that the how part, how you implement those policies, that should be handed over to a professional, meritocratically selected class of administrators, public servants, public administrators, who should decide on the how. And this is largely how many countries do it. And especially South Africa likes to talk about the developmental states. Well, this is what developmental states do. They instantiate that separation. They put all sorts of quite remarkable and difficult processes in place to select public servants, to make sure that they're well qualified, they're well skilled, that they have the right values, the right corps d'esprit it's called, the right organizational mentality to do their jobs. They reward them well, they penalize them heavily if they don't. And their job precisely is to interpret policy and to implement it.
So, I mean, a lot of things seem to be changing, and I mean, there's big conversation around this, I think, in government circles too, from what I understand. And we've already seen some municipal managers work in councils that were first run by the ANC and then the Democratic Alliance. And in fact, I think there's at least one municipal manager who's worked in 2 different councils that were first run by the ANC and then run by the Democratic Alliance. And basically the party in power changed on him twice. Right. And he stayed in office, perfectly happy to do so. That's kind of how it should be, right? And does the fact that our politics is changing lead to these conversations?
So I'm not sure I agree with you. So I think in local government we're in an especially poor situation. So in provincial and national government, ministers and the president and ministers have discretion over appointments and operations. In local government we've gone even further. We've made the politicians actually the administrators. So it's not just simply that the politicians get to decide on who their administrators are. They are often the administrators. So we've completely conflated these roles. So we are arguing that the major reform initiative that needs to happen in South Africa, which we think would transform the country, by the way, it would resolve or help resolve or make progress in resolving many of the institutional crises in many of our provincial governments, our local governments, and in our national departments, is to better separate those roles, especially in local government, where things I think are chronically terrible.
So, I mean, one of the things that civil servants can do is kind of keep the show on the road, keep things running if there's a change. So, for example, we've seen political crises in various places. I mean, the classic case, of course, is Ditsobotla, where you had 2 speakers and 2 councillors, and still, again, this week, more change there. If you had a proper functioning municipal sort of administrators, if you had people who were not political, you would probably still have water in Ditsobotla. Would that be right?
Very likely that you would have water. And this is the idea around separating these spheres. The political sphere should be highly contested. It is it's necessarily volatile, necessarily contested. But that shouldn't mean that our day-to-day lives should be as volatile as the political sphere. And this idea is to have a professional administration that is able to operate irrespective of the turmoil or the changes in the political level. That's the idea of professionalizing the public service, precisely so that we can continue to get electricity, water, roads being maintained, those sorts of things, while politics takes its normal course.
They can shout at each other, someone else can do the actual work.
Right.
There's a thing called the Public Administration Management Bill, which includes a reform that you approve of. What does the reform do?
I think it's a very interesting perspective, which was developed by the Department of Public Service and Administration under Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi in 2008. It's worth taking a step back. We're suddenly in a very interesting moment. Unexpectedly, and to their credit, government has put together this framework on professionalizing the public service, and it arrived largely unexpectedly in 2021. It was approved in 2022 by the South African Cabinet. And what it's done is it's laid out a large framework for professionalizing the public service. And in particular, it puts 2 very important issues firmly on the political agenda, I think, quite frankly, for the first time in South Africa's history. So, I mean, a remarkable advance, and we should give credit where it's due. First of all, it says that public servants should be appointed meritocratically. That's remarkable, and especially given what I've been saying about how all public servants are effectively potentially political appointments. That's an important principle. The second one, and related to that, it says that public servants should be better insulated from inappropriate political interference, allowed to get on with their jobs as professionals. Again, a hugely important intervention. I don't think that this current framework goes far enough in realizing those 2 principles. And yet I do think that there was a framework which was developed under Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi when she was the minister, which I think does. And it's called the Public Administration Management Bill. It was through Minister Sisulu made an act through the Public Administration Management Act, although it's in a shortened or truncated form. But the Management Bill, I think, sets out a very promising model of how we might transform the public service. I mean, it gets quite technical, but essentially what it says is this. The Constitution defines a whole lot of values, fundamental principles or values, which should underpin all public administrations, including the public service. And what we need to do is to set up a set of institutions to monitor and enforce those values across all public administrations. Provincial government, national government, local government, court administrations, state-owned enterprises, so a kind of an overall framework for professionalizing all public administrations. I think it's a very exciting framework, and that's the way I think we should go.
If you're the party in power, would you give up the power that you would have as a politician to actually make these appointments? And isn't that really the problem? And that leads us, of course, very nicely into what could happen in next year's election.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a spot-on question. And the truth is, for the last nearly 30 years, there hasn't been an appetite to give up these powers. So even though I think there's been a growing awareness that this conflation of political and administrative powers is resulting in massive institutional damage and failures failures of delivery, etc. It's what gave us state capture in many respects. It's the mechanism that gave us state capture. The truth is, those powers are very tempting when you've actually got them. My sense, though, is that the political environment is changing, and it's changing in a fundamental and very, very promising way. For the first time again, perhaps in our history, there is a relationship between performance in government and electoral performance. In other words, especially since 2016, the ruling party is losing power on the basis of how poorly or well it's doing in government, whereas other parties seem to be mobilizing or gaining support on the basis of their promise of doing well in government or on their experience in government, including in the DA. The DA claims to be the party of good government, if you like. So that's very promising, because what it opens up for the first time, it makes a space for people like me for public policy thinking around how actually should we design our institutions, how should we staff them, how should we recruit, how should we incentivize people, how do we actually begin the process of rebuilding our public institutions so that they serve you and I, they serve the general public in a way in which they should.
So much to look at. Dr. Ivor Chipkin from the New South Institute, really do appreciate you coming in. Thank you very much indeed.